All set? Okay, great. I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at Center for International Security and Cooperation. I want to welcome you to this panel discussion on global perspectives on the Russian-Ukraine war. Ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we've had numerous seminars here. Scholars from all over the world, former ambassadors, former intelligence officers, Ukrainian officials, Russian exiled journalists have all spoken, but we haven't done what we're doing today, which is ask a group of specialists to comment on how the people in the governments in the areas that they have studied are looking at this war from their perspective. What are the global perspectives here? I will be brief in introducing our three speakers. Erin Baggot Carter is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford and an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at USC. She is also a faculty affiliate of our sister center, Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And she previously was a CSAC postdoctoral fellow here. Šumit Ganguly is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, a professor emeritus of political science and the DeGore Chair Emeritus at Indiana University. He's also taught at University of Texas and at Hunter College. He's written over 20 books, and I am shocked that he does not have, that he was also a CSAC fellow prominently on his bio, but I will mention that here because I'm so proud of it. Harold Trinkunas. Harold Trinkunas is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Scholar here at CSAC. Prior to coming to Stanford, he served as the Charles Robinson Chair and Senior Fellow and Director of the Latin American Initiative in Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Prior to that, he taught and was Associate Professor and then the Chair of the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. Erin will be talking about views from China, Šumit from India, and Harold from Latin America. We will follow the normal CSAC procedures of each speaker speaking. We'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you want to get on the main list, raise your hand and I'll try to catch my attention and put you on the queue. If you want to jump the queue by saying you've got a question that's directly relevant or want to follow up on what was just discussed, raise two fingers and I'll try to get you to jump the queue. We have, I was told 100 people signed up online. For those people online, if you could type in your question on the Q&A function, we'll have cards written and they'll come up to me and I'll try to rotate from people inside to people online. And without further ado, let's turn to our panel and join me in welcoming Erin, Šumit, and Harold.
Fantastic. Let me turn this on. Is that good for the online audience? Good. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Scott, for the warm welcome. And it's really a pleasure to be back here at CSAC, joining this really interesting panel on such an important issue. So to get started, I just want to outline where my remarks are going to go. First, I would like to talk a bit about the extent or the current status of collaboration between China and Russia, more broadly in sort of the global order, so we can sort of set expectations about where Ukraine interests might lie. Then I want to talk in detail about China's position on the Ukraine war, what's going on, what thus far. Very unexpectedly in the conflict, and to much as any one person can shed light on it, what we might expect from a Trump administration on this issue of China collaboration in a resolution for the Ukraine conflict. So to get started about the extent of collaboration, as everyone in this room probably knows, in 2022, days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Xi and Putin famously met and announced their partnership had no limits, which is something you often see in the news. In reality, I think a very good way to understand China's support and stance on the Ukraine conflict is as what Evan Mediaros has called a straddle policy, something that is akin to pro-Russian neutrality. those, when looking at Ukraine conflicts, I think that one of the most fundamental ways to see that's a big thing is that Washington does not want to be in the world once it's isolated as Washington rival, right? So of course it is Washington's main rival, but Russia is sort of certainly a leading rival. China sees a world in which Russia was a diminished power, had lost the Ukraine conflict, is one in which it seems that you have a global battle between China and the United States, which China has always wanted to slow down, right? So China has for decades and still now very much sees the threat of Western containment as the leading threat to its rise. And it thinks that a world in which Russia was not a major geopolitical player would be one in which Washington would much more quickly turn to effectively containing China, especially with multilateral support. So in thinking about these goals of the so-called straddle policy, it has succeeded to some extent, but has also failed in really important ways. Of course, Russia is still a major player. It's still a major contender in the conflict, and may indeed expect to win important policy objectives, especially in a Trump administration. However, the straddle policy has also been challenged in really important respects. The West is more united in really important ways. NATO has expanded. Also, several years ago, so prior to 2017, NATO rarely addressed China and did so in really neutral ways. In 2021, it's talking about, quote, systemic challenges from China, talking about pivoting NATO interests and NATO policies, thinking about the Indo-Pacific. That is very much not in China's interests. In a more broader sort of ideological sense, the division of the world into a democratic bloc and an autocratic bloc has really become much more pronounced. There's one really interesting recent report from the University of Cambridge, which found that 75% of people surveyed in democracies now feel negatively towards China. So this is a really deepened divide, both ideologically with major strategic implications for China and its ability to operate in the world. Now, moving on to the extent of China-Russia collaboration today, China and Russia have certainly been having more joint military exercises. Actually, in October, it was the first time the Chinese Coast Guard held a joint exercise in the Arctic, which is seen as a really important strategic objective because of oil shipments through the Strait of Malacca being so constrained strategically. They're also collaborating space. China, on the economic front, is Russia's #1 trading partner. Russia, on the other hand, is only China's 6th most important trading partner. This is 2023 data. Specifically, if you look at data that's disaggregated, trade with China, it totals around 26% of Russia's total trade, pretty substantively large. But as a share of China's total trade, Russia only accounts for 3%. Right, so there's a major difference in how important these two countries are towards each other economically. That said, if we break out oil, oil is a bit more different strategically because of how important oil imports are to China's development. There, Russia has become, since Western sanctions have taken place, the most important source of oil for China. It accounts for around 19% of China's crude oil imports today. That's marginally ahead of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So from the Russian side, all of these imports are important from China. This is especially the case for the oil trade, because the oil actually accounts for around half of the Russian government budget, so oil exports. So from a regime stability point and funding point of view, this market in China is incredibly important from the Russian point of view. So moving on to China's official position, despite a lot of pro-Russian stances in effect that I'll get to in a minute, it has sought to present itself as neutral in the Ukraine conflict. It's abstained from nearly all UN resolutions that have condemned Russia's invasion. It has not technically provided Russia with lethal aid in the war, but it does supply a large number of dual-use materials, which are very important for the war effort. So there have been a couple of really fantastic reports from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Politico. And some of these, I'll read you a really fascinating list of these dual-use materials. So things like navigation equipment, jamming technology, even fighter jet parts, some of them can technically be qualified as sort of dual use. Very large supplies of gunpowder and its precursor component called nitrocellulose, various drone parts, even body armor. And perhaps the best anecdote was 1,000 assault rifles that were classified as civilian hunting rifles. So these things are very much stretching out the ability of the Russian defense industrial base to conduct this war. It has also supplied excavators that have been used to build important Russian fortifications. Relatedly, so China has helped Russia evade sanctions in many important ways. So one really good example of this is Norilsk Nickel, which is a nickel copper mining firm, and it was permitted to form a joint venture with a Chinese company. And as a result, Russia was able to technically export copper, but it was branded as a Chinese sourced copper. So that was a way to evade sanctions. So all of these things have been really essential to the Russian economy in enabling it to sort of continue with the war effort. In terms of propaganda, so it's very common on social media and in sort of official propaganda produced by the Chinese government to portray the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a legitimate response to NATO expansion and NATO activities in the world. In 2023, China proposed a 12-point peace plan. It did not call for Russian withdrawal, but it did sort of advocate for a variety of specific steps that might help achieve a ceasefire and a peace plan. Now, in terms of the US and Ukrainian response to these Chinese policies, in 2024, a couple months ago, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that China was not giving weapons directly, but was providing inputs to Russia's defense industrial base. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has also said that China's support for Russia's defense industry was prolonging the war. So this consensus is really sort of coming together at this point. For its part, Ukraine's policy on China has evolved over time. In May 2022, right at the beginning of things, Zelensky said something quite interesting, which was that China has chosen the policy of staying away. At the moment, Ukraine is satisfied with that policy. In June this summer, he, for the first time, really came out and actively accused China of prolonging the war and undermining the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland this summer, which China declined to attend. So I don't know if I'm running out of time here. Can I? Okay, fantastic. So I'll do it. I think that one thing that's particularly been in the news lately has been drones. So let's do a bit of a deep dive on that. This has just been, even in today and the past few days, it's been in the news. So China has recently restricted the sale of drone components to the EU and to the US. So the basic environment here is that China controls around 90% of the drone market worldwide and even 80% in the United States. That's because drones require a lot of components, motors, flight equipment, batteries, importantly, and all of those are necessary to build drones, no matter where they're manufactured or put together, really. So the new restrictions from China on the sale of these drone components is itself a sort of tit-for-tat reaction to new US sanctions in December on high bandwidth memory chips and other semiconductor equipment going to China. Some people have also interpreted this new Chinese restriction as a message to the Trump administration that is going to stand firm in any potential trade war of the future. More broadly, commercial drones have, as you may know, they become incredibly important in the Ukraine conflict. It's sort of a new technology that is changing the face of warfare. The reason is that these dual-use drones that you can easily buy, because they're not sort of branded military goods, they're very helpful for conducting reconnaissance in real time, so seeing what enemy lines are doing. They're also useful for sort of targeting weapons and for actually dropping light bombs. So really important on both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. Both sides have been intensively using them. So how you might wonder how China came to control such a huge share of the global market for drones, including the United States. This is part of the typical overcapacity and dumping story that's become important in so many Chinese industries. In 2019, the Undersecretary for Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, Ellen Lord, said, in her view, we don't have much of a UAS, that's drone industrial base here in the United States, because DJI, that's the most important Chinese drone manufacturer, dumped so many low-priced quadcopters on the market, and then we became dependent on them. As an aside, there's a really interesting book coming out in a couple months that you all should buy. So Yasheng Huang, who's an economist at MIT, has a new book, sort of an update of his old famous book on the capitalism with Chinese characteristics. He's now looking at statism with Chinese characteristics. And one of the really interesting findings in the book is that China's overcapacity in various important areas, so such as batteries, such as electric vehicles, exceeds total current global demand. That's the extent of the investment and overcapacity issue in China. So drone overcapacity should be seen in this light as well. So China has sanctioned various firms for engaging in drone manufacturing abroad. So in particular, US firms that have, so Skydio is one example, has engaged with contracts with Taiwan, has been subject to battery export controls from China. So all of these issues have led to a climate of discussion in the US very much favoring a move towards producing more drones within the United States to have more supply chain independence from China more broadly. So that's a bit of a deep dive. That's where we are now. These sanctions are really important. So there aren't that many recent estimates on this, but there was one really interesting estimate from the UK Royal United Services in May of 2023. And what they found was that Ukraine was losing around 10,000 drones per month to Russia. So these sorts of drone supply issues are really important in the actual conduct of the war. So to move on briefly to North Korea, which no one really anticipated, in November of this year, North Korea sent around 10,000 troops to fight in Ukraine. They've so far engaged in combat. This caught China unawares, people believe, no one knows for sure. And many see this as an embarrassing episode for China, insofar as North Korea is very much seen as Beijing's junior diplomatic partner. To see this happening, many believe, without Beijing's knowledge, is casting that into doubt. There isn't very much official Chinese discourse on the issue. So the foreign ministry spokesperson said, when asked about this issue, that collaboration between Russia and North Korea was a matter for those two sovereign countries themselves, and they claimed that Beijing was unaware of the specifics. More broadly, sort of moving into unofficial discourse, some Chinese experts are concerned that Russia might get involved in a potential crisis on the North Korean peninsula if it were to arise, or that combat experience which North Korean troops have lacked historically, or at least in recent memory, that could potentially embolden North Korea in a potential conflict. So that's more or less the status of discussion on that issue. Looking towards the future, your guess may be as good as mine in many cases where this may go. But what we know for a fact is that Trump recently announced that he had a call with Xi Jinping and he had discussed the role of China in a potential Ukraine ceasefire mediation. Famously, Trump had previously said that he would solve the Ukraine crisis in one day. What he has suggested is that it would be important to have China involved in arranging a ceasefire between the two sides, although the specific contours of what he has in mind have not been articulated. I think that what we know from the past is that Trump has threatened to cut military aid to Ukraine, has threatened to withdraw US from NATO. So I think it's fair to say that Russia is looking forward to potentially having a resolution more on its terms than might have been the case under a potential Harris administration. I do think, though, that one interesting way that the debate is moving is that Mike McFaul recently published an article in Foreign Affairs that called for or suggested that Trump could arrange a bargain in which Ukraine would agree to relinquish claims to some of the territory that Russia has occupied in exchange for admission to NATO. So that's one potential idea that has been put out there on the table, although that, of course, is perhaps more favorable to Ukraine than Putin would like to agree to at this point. But I think I'll stop there, and we'll learn about more takes on the conflict and the war from other areas of the world.
Good. What's yours?
Thanks very much, Scott, and my apologies for that obvious oversight that I was here at CSAC 20 years ago, and delighted to be back here again. Now, my talks are divided into three distinct segments. First, I'll talk about a puzzle, then I'll talk about potential explanations for the puzzle, and what are the prospects of things changing or not from the standpoint of New Delhi. Why is New Delhi's position on the Ukraine a puzzle? Because New Delhi has maintained a kind of a studious silence and has not in any way condemned, far from condemned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and won't even use the word invasion. It's carefully and scrupulously avoided the use of that word and refers to it as a crisis. It's a puzzle because, warts and all, it is still a democratic country, which has historically been a sovereignty hawk. India was quite skeptical in the 1990s and early part of the the 21st century about the very notion of the responsibility to protect. It was one of the more hesitant players in the international system when it came to endorsing the idea of the responsibility to protect, and instead said sovereignty is still the organizing principle in the world, taking a very Westphalian view of the subject for reasons we can go into later. So it's a democratic country, it takes sovereignty very seriously, and it faces a significant long-term security threat to its own sovereignty from its behemoth neighbor, the People's Republic of China. And in fact, faced a major clash in the Himalayas in the spring of 2020, where substantial numbers of Indian soldiers were killed in hand-to-hand combat. And so India's position for all these three reasons remains a bit of a puzzle, that India should condemn the blatant violation of the sovereignty of another state, albeit far away. At best, Prime Minister Modi, after much prodding, has publicly stated in a meeting, following a meeting with Putin, that this is not a time for war, and that Russia and Ukraine should seek a diplomatic resolution to the crisis. A very anodyne formulation, to put it mildly. And it was only after a visit to Moscow in July of this year, when Russian missiles were raining down on a children's hospital in Kyiv, faced with widespread criticism, both from within and particularly outside of India, especially in the Western world, Modi made a rather symbolic visit to Kyiv in late August. And this after Zelensky had criticized publicly, upbraided Modi on his position on the war. What explains India's position then? I would argue there are at least 4 or 5 reasons why India has maintained this kind of studious silence, or at best come up with these very anodyne responses. The first is a fairly straightforward one. It's path dependence. According to SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, 65% of India's arsenal, conventional arsenal, is composed of either Soviet or Russian origin. And consequently, India just cannot turn off the tap overnight. It just doesn't have the resources domestically to replace weaponry or spare parts, nor does it have the resources to buy them on the global arms market. Over the last 2 decades, India has purchased, prior to the war, $60 billion of weaponry from Russia, again underscoring this path dependence. There are entire components of India's arsenal which are acutely dependent on either Soviet era, more likely Russian spare parts. Just for the sake of comparison, since 2008, according to the Congressional Research Service, it has contracted to buy about $20 billion worth of weaponry from the United States as it attempts to slowly shift its weapons, shift away from this dependence on Russia. And I'll talk about why India is doing that, in part because of drastic cost overruns. One of India's aircraft carriers is the former Admiral Gorshakov, and the cost overruns and the delays were really significant, which gave the Indians some pause about buying major weapon systems from Russia. And Russia, unlike in the Soviet days, will not accept rupee to ruble payment, nor will it accept Indian consumer goods in exchange, which worked out well during the Cold War, but those days are long over. Now payments have to be made in hard currency, making Russian weaponry less attractive as it was. I mean, during the Cold War, the Russians were willing to transfer the MiG-29 to India, even though it wasn't willing to transfer it at the same time to its fraternal allies in Eastern Europe. It provided India the MiG-31, the MiG-35, largely because it was one democratic country that it could pretty well rely on, particularly from the 1970s, for a variety of complex reasons, which I can go into during the Q&A. Second, under the present government, India has found it completely expedient to purchase Russian oil at lower than market prices, at significantly lower than market prices. Strikingly, Russian crude prior to the invasion of Ukraine accounted for about 1% of India's imports. Guess where it stands now? They constitute close to 40% of India's imports. And when asked about this, Subramaniam Jaishankar, the very able foreign minister, said, yes, what do you expect me to do? I need to keep oil prices down at home for maintaining domestic price stability. And if someone's willing to sell us oil at this price, I'm going to buy it. In any case, he went on to add that Europe has no qualms about buying the refined oil from us. So where's the hypocrisy here? I'm merely reflecting his words. I'm not making a normative statement on my part. Third, New Delhi also hopes that its studied silence on the Ukraine issue may stave off, and this I think is a forlorn hope, but it genuinely believes that it can prevent a closing of the ranks of the PRC with Russia. This is India's nightmare scenario. This is what India really dreads, that the PRC and Russia really forge a long-term strategic partnership, not just this kind of incipient partnership that Erin has talked about, but a real closing of the ranks and hostility towards India. And this would be India's most dire scenario. It is interesting to note that at the recent BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia, Putin brokered a meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping, and they were not on talking terms since the spring of 2020 because of the Chinese incursions in areas where disputed areas of the Himalayan border. And there has been just the beginnings of a thaw, though hardly a rapprochement. That I don't think is in the cards, and it better not be, because I've written a book which argues precisely the opposite. Yeah, that's not a trivial matter. Spent a long time working on this book, so my prediction had better not be proven wrong. I better write to Modi about this. Finally, and this is a bit inchoate and intangible, and it's based upon extensive conversations with the Indian foreign policy elite. I have no survey data to back this up, but certainly elite opinion, I think I can state with some authority, there's a segment of Indian elite opinion that suffers from a certain Cold War nostalgia. It permeates a segment of the Indian foreign policy elite, and it would be good to get survey data to back this up, though that's a bit of a stretch, because often people would prefer to have these preferences concealed in a survey. In their eyes, Russia remains a tried and true friend. It's, of course, involves a degree of selective amnesia, because there were plenty of occasions when the Russians walked away from India and left India in the cold. But they remember certain critical junctures, and that's what forms their view of Moscow. They want to emphasize that Russia has been willing to provide certain weapon systems and technologies that no other state has proffered, either for friendship or for money. For example, Russia had leased India an Akula-class submarine in 2023, which enabled Indian sailors to learn how to use a nuclear-powered submarine and laid the foundations for India's pursuit of a nuclear-powered submarine, and has offered to sell India one in 2025, though that sort of remains in abeyance. What are the prospects then of this relationship and India's position on the war? Is it likely to evolve? Is it likely to change? For the present government in New Delhi believes that it can pursue what it calls a policy of multi-alignment. Essentially, pared to the bone, this means maintaining good relations with the US and Europe, while simultaneously acting as a spokesperson for the global South, and a ruthlessly pragmatic policy towards Russia, setting aside moral and ethical qualms. However, in my judgment, it may discover, especially with the incoming Trump administration, that American strategic patience, a term that a friend of mine, Ashley Tellis, has coined, is not unlimited. That the US, while it wants a robust strategic partnership with India, in part because of the PRC's role in Asia, India is not indispensable, contrary to what people in New Delhi might think. Furthermore, Russia's ability to remain a reliable weapons supplier to India is now increasingly at question following the Ukraine war. It has delayed the supply of a crucial weapons system for India, the S-400 surface-to-air missile batteries, and these were supposed to be delivered this year. The year is drawing to a close, and the Russians say, well, hopefully we'll give you the two more batteries that we had promised, either next year or possibly in 2026, even though the Indians have paid for them. This may, over time, lead New Delhi to reconsider its dependence on Russia, even though shifting gears is not going to be easy, as I made clear at the outset, given the sheer dominance of Russian weaponry, from Kalashnikov rifles to the T-72, the T-80 tanks, an array of jet aircraft and the like. That said, given the strong streak of incrementalism that permeates India's political culture, in the absence of a significant internal or external shock, it's unlikely that India's policies will undergo a dramatic shift towards Russia.
Thank you, Šumit. Let's turn it over to Harold.
Great, thank you so much. It's actually been super interesting to note parallels, I think, across, as I'll illustrate now when I talk about Latin America, in sort of China's, India, and the approach of many Latin American countries towards this conflict. But of course, it is a region, not a country, so I have to address some of the heterogeneity that we find in Latin America. But like Šumit, I start from a puzzle, which is that Latin America is one of the regions of the world whose history and diplomatic traditions would suggest that it would view the Russian invasion as a violation of international law, sovereignty, and of the doctrine of non-intervention. It's a region that, after all, was the home of countries that were among the first advocates of these norms in international law. And in fact, from the Western perspective, Latin America has been criticized for not saying enough, not doing enough, not criticizing Russia. And so you'll see articles like how I try to explain to my Ukrainian friends why Latin America does not support them. In fact, if you look at UN General Assembly voting records, which is traditionally a metric political scientists like to use to determine alignment, Latin American countries, by and large, either strongly aligned with the West or have voted pro-Western positions more often than not. Only countries that were aligned with Russia prior to 2022, like Cuba, Nicaragua, and if Venezuela was still allowed to vote, Venezuela, have vocally supported Russia. However, this studied silence is a policy that a number of important Latin American countries have avoided. They avoided rhetorical condemnation of Russia. They have almost unanimously avoided material support to Ukraine. And at best, in the case of Brazil and Mexico, have proposed some sort of negotiated peace settlement that would include both negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, which has not prospered. So I'm going to do the rest of the talk is talk first about factors that Latin American states have in common that might influence their perspective towards the conflict. Then I'll talk briefly about some of the differences that separate them. I'll talk a little bit more about the actual reaction of Latin American countries, the positions countries have taken, and the kinds of support they've been willing to take. And finally, I'll talk about what explains this reluctance to criticize Russia or support Ukraine overtly, and maybe a word or two on what might happen in the Trump administration. So what does Latin America have in common in facing this conflict? First of all, it's a low-stakes conflict for them. They do not see this as salient for the Latin American foreign policy agenda. Latin America is geographically very remote from the conflict, in fact, remote from the rest of the world. And so geopolitically, this is not a salient issue for them. They're not like India facing a rival across the border. They're not like Poland worried about what's happening in the war or NATO. The other thing to keep in mind is that from the Latin American perspective, the international system, the threat is not a security threat by and large, although occasionally the US has been a threat to some countries in the past. It's really an economic threat and an economic resource. So that's what they worry about. How do we extract resources and minimize the costs of being part of this international economic system? And finally, the reason this is low stakes for Latin American politicians is that foreign policy is a very low priority for most Latin American voters, low in comparison to other parts of the world. So that's one reason why Latin America is not engaged very much on this conflict. But secondly, Latin America's diplomatic tradition, its foreign policy tradition, has moved decisively towards the peaceful resolution of disputes rather than picking sides when it comes to international conflict. It's a region of declining interstate conflict for over 100 years. The last war was in 1994-95 between Ecuador and Peru. So it's a region that does not see war as a solution to issues. It's a region that has either resolved all its border conflicts or judicialized them. So the way you solve conflicts with your neighbors is by going to the International Court of Justice, and your lawyers deal with it, not your soldiers. And it's also a country that's deprioritized military solutions to international issues, which makes sense if you think of the fact that for most of these countries that are democracies, their history is that their own military is a bigger threat to the regime than their neighbor's military. So why would you do anything to prioritize military solutions to international disputes? So what are the differences? First of all, we have to understand that the political economy of the region makes it quite heterogeneous. And so there's one political economy that encompasses North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and that orients those countries towards relations with the United States. These countries provide cheap manufacturing, assembly. They provide labor, obviously, legally and illegally. Mexico and Canada, obviously, but Mexico is very connected to the United States. In fact, Mexico sees China as a rival in the same kind of manufacturing space. So then there's South America, which relies heavily on primary product exports, many of them to China, so about equal to China, Europe, and the US, and is not quite as tightly captured by sort of the North American economic market. And so you see differences between those two political economies, so to speak, within the region. And secondly, politically and ideologically, it's also divided. There's definitely a democracy-autocracy divide, and the autocracies are by and large pro-Russian and pro-China, so Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. There is a left-right divide. And so just like in many other parts of the world, voters punish incumbents. In fact, Latin American voters are very good at punishing incumbents, so there's regular right-left switches. And so when there's a switch, that has a consequence for foreign policy, especially because I think like in India, where you say some foreign policy elites are sort of this nostalgia for the Soviet period, that is true on the Latin American left, in certain countries as well. There's also kind of a new left that is it's more principled when it comes to this war. Chile is an example of that. So how has Latin America reacted? So there's some countries that are strongly aligned with the United States position. Argentina has been very vocal, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. Chile, as I mentioned, because of President Boric, kind of a new left figure, Paraguay. However, there's some other important countries that are really engaged in a strategy, which I'll explain in a minute, of hedging. And so you see a lot of other countries that are taking this middle position. And when they do provide support to the West, it's at institutions like the United Nations, the General Assembly, but not rhetorically and not willing to provide material support to Ukraine. And in fact, at the recent G20 summit in Rio, one argument for why the final statement was kind of watered down when it came to the war in Ukraine was in part Brazil, the host, was opposed to language that would condemn Russia. So instead, what they've sought to do is this international, negotiated, bring everybody to the table approach to ending the war, which is very much in line with sort of Brazil and Mexico's diplomatic traditions. In each case, Lula Silva, in the case of Brazil, Lopez Obrador, in the case of Mexico, pushed these ideas, but they did not prosper, in part because they couldn't get China on board. And what explains this? Some scholars in Latin America argue that this is hedging, that there's an incentive to play towards the middle to see what kinds of resources you can extract from either side. And in fact, a very interesting article by Shanoni, Leva, and Carvalho argues that it's really a fence-sitting strategy, that this is, even though the conflict is highly polarized between Russia and the West, it is not a polarizing issue in their relations with Latin American countries, which means you can move quite a bit towards Russia or quite a bit towards the United States before you get punished. And there's even evidence that, I mean, the US hasn't done very much to punish Latin American countries. Brazil has a major purchaser of Russian fertilizer and Russian diesel. On the other hand, when Ecuador said they would transfer $200 million in aging military equipment to the US, presumably this be sent to Ukraine in return for modern weapons, Russia immediately sanctioned Ecuador's exports of bananas, and that caused the government to walk back that decision. So, but that space in the middle between the two countries allows for some maneuver, some strategic autonomy, which is especially important for the bigger countries like Mexico and Brazil. And paradoxically, even though these are countries that say they're very strong on non-intervention and sovereignty, there's still a persistent tacit belief among many elites, again, one of these sort of things they probably would not want to reveal, that they're kind of sympathetic to the spheres of influence argument, and they see Ukraine as they're sympathetic to the Russian argument that Ukraine should be in the Russian sphere of influence, and that this is all NATO's fault for expanding too quickly. And so that resonates, especially since, from the Latin Americans' perspective, they were the region of the world that has the most experience with US hegemony and spheres of influence, right? And so they see the world instinctively this way, even though normatively they would like it not to be. I think, as I already mentioned, I think leader beliefs matter. And so you see this switching. So when the Argentine presidential election led to the election of a right libertarian candidate, Milei, Argentina switched from soft sympathy for Russia to condemnation of Russia. But not always. And interestingly, both Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, a right-wing populist, and Lula da Silva, a left-of-center president, currently had been fairly neutral or promoting or sympathetic to soft sympathy towards Russia. Some people have argued trade may make a difference, and this might be the case in the case of Brazil, but even there, Russia's not really a major regional trading partner. I mean, it does supply weapons to a couple countries, but even there, they're rapidly moving to replace them, with the exception, again, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And finally, Russia, popular support for Russia is not really a factor. I mean, there's probably a prevalence of some anti-Americanism in certain Latin American countries, some hostility to NATO. And even though Russia has a major media presence in Latin America, RT, the Spanish language version of RT, is one of the largest foreign media outlets in the region, with over 32 million regular viewers. Public opinion towards Russia has been hardening on this conflict. So to wrap up, what might change all of this? What might lead Latin America countries to stop hedging? Well, one would be if this becomes a much more prominent issue on the Trump administration's agenda to push Latin America towards a certain position on the conflict. Russia, I mean, we're not really expecting much change there, and it's shown that it's willing to impose costs, but really for some pretty, for doing things like providing military support for Ukraine. But short of that, they haven't really done very much other than rhetorically. They had sort of praised Brazil's peace club idea. They support President Lula's both sidism that he tends to speak. But really, I think the change would be from the Trump administration is one possibility. And of course, it depends on what the president actually decides to do on Ukraine and how he decides to approach it. And the second thing that can happen is obviously there can be, Latin America is by and large a democratic region in the world. There can be elections. There's been a regular alternation between right and left. And so obviously leadership in key countries could change. Although both President Lula left of center and the new president of Mexico also left of center, and those still being two prominent regional leaders, I don't really think that that's, in the short term, a major source of potential change in Latin America's views on the Ukraine-Russia war. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to get people catching my attention and get a list. And then if I could get the cards for people who are asking questions online, I'll be able to do that. And my starting question is for Erin and Šumit. I was at a meeting recently about deterrence of the use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war. There were four explanations given why using nuclear weapons to end the war, citing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the U.S. overheard chatter. The CIA reportedly went from saying there's a 5% chance to 50-50 chance of nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine. There are four explanations given for why that didn't happen. One was that the United States deterred Russia by threatening to get involved conventionally in the war in Ukraine. The second was that Putin was just bluffing all along, had no interest or no intent to use nuclear weapons. The third was that the Russians were losing when they were making the threats, and when they stabilized the lines, then he didn't have an interest. But the fourth was that India and China persuaded.
I have not seen anything in the Indian press that suggests that Modi played such a significant role in trying to persuade Putin. And I'm not even convinced that Modi wields that kind of influence over Putin. There was some careless chatter in the Indian press that about how Modi is trying to influence the conduct of the war, but the evidence for that is pretty thin gruel.
Yeah, so for China, the not using nuclear weapons in this conflict has been an important policy principle. So in particular, the 12-point peace plan that China released one of the points was the importance of not using nuclear weapons in the conflict and the importance of keeping conflict away from several nuclear energy facilities. So that said, though, while that, in principle has been an important objective for China, in practice, there have been really no confirmed sources or stories or pieces of information that I'm aware of that have linked, a specific diplomatic initiative or sort of behind the scenes pressure from Xi to put Putin about this. This is something that, we don't really have that much actual.
And to give our speakers and the audience a sense of where your question is coming from, please.
Yes, I'm Sergei Sanovich. I'm at Hoover Institution working on disinformation and writing. But my question was interesting because with invasion, which is interesting. To me, it was the opposite. That these non-Western countries, some of which are actual adversaries of the United States, their support for Russia was so limited, right? And so what I want to bring to this conversation about Russian war against Ukraine is Ukraine. That is, limited in many ways to what Erin said about China, right? This drones. They were much more curious about the Ivan speaking of Arabic League and Gulf states, and Turkey has this very ambiguous position, and this idea that China prevented nuclear weapons and so forth. What is the role of Ukrainian diplomacy in making this support that all these countries give to Russia so limited in practical terms, and helping Russia in such a limited, or in some cases, no capacity at all? Thank you.
Well, I probably have the easiest time with this, because it's, again, the default position of Latin America is to not support it's not to not pick a side, right? This deliberately runs counter to the foreign policy traditions of pretty much all the major countries, with the exception of the ones who are already autocratic and pro-Russia anyway, before the war, again, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. But Mexico has a firm policy of neutrality. Brazil likes to say it's one of the only countries in the world that has an embassy in every single other country, and it's friends to everybody. So non-aligned that it's not part of the non-aligned movement. So, and a country that in their mission statement for their white paper released back in the 2000s, early 2000s, used the word peace or peaceful 6 times in 5 sentences as the mission statement for the Ministry of Defense. So it's just, the default position would be to not provide any kind of support, but diplomatically, they have gone along with a sovereigntist position in the United Nations, which they do see as the most legitimate venue for resolving conflicts.
In the Indian case, Zelensky's public upbraiding of India had some effect. Otherwise, Modi would not have gone to Kyiv. But substantively, Modi, it did not move the needle. It was just a polite, symbolic diplomatic gesture.
So in the case of China, I think Ukraine's diplomacy has actually been incredibly sophisticated and on point. So in particular, if you look over the history of it, so Ukraine has been juggling a couple really interesting competing objectives very well from the beginning. So in particular, at the very beginning, especially when you saw that quote from Zelensky, this public statement that we're fine with the status quo, we're fine with China's current actions, just, please don't support Russia anymore. That I think that was very carefully calculated. And until very recently, Ukraine, I think, has been pursuing a policy of trying to avoid antagonizing Russia or antagonizing China, excuse me, to avoid pushing it even closer towards Russia. So you've seen, even though the US, especially the UK, even NATO coming out and saying more critically that the Chinese dual use exports are really improving the base, the Russian defense industrial base's ability to, fight this war. Ukraine avoided saying that until really just recently when Xi Jinping decided that China would not attend the Switzerland peace conference that Ukraine was very interested in, instead trying to favor its own plan. That was the thing that made Zelensky finally come out and say, these dual-use technologies and dual-use exports are prolonging this war and really sort of helping Russia. And I think, that silence for so long was also because Ukraine, the trade with China has also been very important, right? So China's an important export market. It buys a lot of Ukrainian goods. The BRI has been very important as well, sort of, in theory. So I think that all of those things led to a very careful stance of not antagonizing China until this very recent snub in Switzerland.
Hi, my name's Fahad. I'm a visiting fellow at CSAC this year. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Say what you work at. I've asked everyone to say a little bit more about themselves.
Sure. So my work is at the intersection of domestic politics and international security. My question is, first question is for the panel, because as being the world's largest democracy and a lot of countries in the global south being democracies, but being on the fence in this conflict. Doesn't that sort of, to my mind, that weakens this notion that it is a conflict between democracy and non-democracy with so many countries that have elections being on the fence? And then a question for Šumit, if I may. You spoke very eloquently about the view or this sort of the view from Delhi vis-a-vis Moscow and the sort of nostalgia that the strategic elite seems to have for the Cold War. I wonder if you could sort of elaborate a bit more on what the view is of the United States.
Sure. So I think that's a great and really important question. Probing the extent to which there is this global realignment or sort of intensification of this block nature of democracy versus autocracy, which is something that the Biden administration has talked about a lot, right? So it's something that is an explicit goal of the U.S. foreign policy, championing democracy worldwide. So I think that to the extent, I'm sure Šumit will speak to the extent that India has realigned, but I think more broadly, one of the core things that Chinese scholars write about and worry about is the extent to which broad long-term shifts in public opinion in democracies eventually produce really meaningful changes in foreign policy. So in particular, I think that the sea change really in how voters in democracies view China becoming much, much, much more negative in general over the past 10 years, but especially following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and China's support for Russia. I think that is creating a new strategic environment for China. And you can see the extent to which Beijing worries about that and its efforts to influence some democratic outcomes. So there was this really interesting recent Microsoft report on sort of Chinese and Russian influence campaigns online in advance of the US presidential election. And what it found was that, interestingly enough, there was a lot of targeting of congressional districts and congressional candidates in the United States, in particular based on whether candidates perceived as pro or anti-China. And that's something you also see in the writings of Chinese scholars who, since the early 2000s, actually have argued that it's really important to try to influence parliaments worldwide because you need to sort of try to contain that anti-China faction that is going to have more aggressive foreign policy, which is going to create these, China policies coming out of democracies that are aimed at containing China. So I do think you can see that China cares a great deal about how democracies are changing in public opinion, how that will eventually bubble up into foreign policy, in creating sort of a climate of multilateral action that's going to be much more against China's interest than it was previously.
Despite India being a democracy, historically, its positions on international conflicts, harking back to the days of the Cold War, have varied considerably. There is no sort of consistent. For example, French invasion took place of Egypt over the Suez Canal crisis. India condemned it unequivocally, but the position was largely because these were two imperial powers coming back into the Middle East. And Prime Minister Nehru took an unequivocal position on that. And yet, in that same year, when Hungary was invaded, Nehru kind of waffled on this. And I was recently writing an article when I decided to look into the archives, which are now open. Nehru's justification was there's no point in our grandstanding because the Soviets don't care. Democracy has led to a consistent outcome. In terms of the frustrations that the Indians have with the United States, that's mostly in the past. It's mostly the Cold War legacy. Currently, there are very few things that they are concerned about, with the exception of two issues. One, the steady democratic recession in India, which they are extremely sensitive about, and they are willing to push back against, particularly if it involves the Prime Minister himself. And second, they also don't want to be hectored on Ukraine, at least not publicly hectored on Ukraine. Private conversations, they're happy to deal with. But the thing that concerns them the most, whether it's from American academics, Indian expatriates, especially Indian expatriates, and particularly members of Congress, on India's sort of precipitous democratic recession from 2014 onwards. This is an issue where the government will promptly close ranks.
So on this issue of democracy versus autocracy, you see this play out in Latin America if you compare the present to the 1990s, which was with the exception of Cuba, continent-wide period where all the regimes were democratic. There was a strong commitment to defense of democracy, and democracy promotion was a shared value. But what we see in the more recent decades is that this is now modified by ideology. And so it's notable that the center-left governments in the region are much more reluctant to criticize either sort of Russia, or even autocrats in their midst. You saw this play out after the stolen July 2024 Venezuelan presidential elections, where many democracies in the region very forthrightly condemned this, whereas Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, all led by sort of center-left leaders, really tried to sort of take a very soft approach, in the end produced nothing, with the dictator sort of poised to remain in power. So it's definitely modified by ideology, and there's been an erosion of this norm of support for democracy in the region. And you see that in public opinion polling too, by the way.
Rob Rako.
Hello, I'm Rob Rakove. I'm a diplomatic historian here. I'm poised on the brink of a remarkably ambitious and daunting project, a study of CSAC, in fact. I have a quick question for Erin. So we recently had the saga of the wayward Chinese freighter in the Baltic, which was bringing internet disruptions in its literal wake. And it leads me to really wonder how the balance of leverage distributes between China and Europe. Can Europe meaningfully retaliate against China if it thinks China is acting egregiously, or does the leverage move in the other direction? Thank you.
This is a really fantastic question. So I think that to think about that, it's useful to look at China's very recent diplomacy. So Xi Jinping recently visited Europe, and I think that in looking at the places he visited, France, especially Hungary, I think is an interesting choice. I think that in comparison with earlier years, so I think earlier, so let me actually start with a great story. So Hank Paulson, in his memoirs, which are a fantastic read, I remember them, I recommend them, he recounted this one really interesting episode in which right after Lehman Brothers collapsed, this episode transpired when Moscow called Beijing and said, hey, if we work together to sell all of our US Treasury securities, we can ruin the American economy and usher in this new multipolar world in which the United States plays a much diminished role. Beijing declined in that episode and called Washington and told Paulson about this offer. And what's interesting, I think, about Xi Jinping's recent diplomacy towards Europe is that Beijing is moving a lot closer to Russia and what it hopes Europe will look like in the future. So Putin, historically, and you can read this very clearly in Russian propaganda, would like to see this conservative Europe that is not sort of acting multilaterally, in which you have these very sort of specific conservative countries that are acting of their own accord. And I do think that China increasingly is moving towards wanting that because it's worried about Europe acting in concert, and especially with the United States as well, to sort of promote these democratic norms and work effectively in containing China, which is something that you've seen come out of Ukraine. You actually have seen a lot of very effective coordination between the United States and Europe. So I think that you can see that Xi Jinping is hoping that Europe will split and may well sort of be engaging in influence attempts in parliamentary elections to sort of bolster more sort of conservative or far-right candidates who see sort of a post-EU Europe as sort of this ideal future. So I do think you see moves there, and in terms of Europe being able to effectively push back against Chinese initiatives and wishes, I think that what is concerning is that you do see these Chinese moves to sort of hope for a more fragmented Europe, but you have seen a lot of coordination, a lot of effective economic policy coordination, especially the United States in the past few years. So I think that right now, any moves to sort of help to preserve supply chains and sort of work to make Europe more independent in energy supplies and rare minerals, I think all of those would be positive steps.
Tobias.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fantastic discussions. I'm Tobias Festner, I'm a visiting scholar at CSAC and normally based in Geneva. We're at the outbreak of the war. I got a lot of media requests for interviews regarding the question of neutrality, including from a major Indian newspaper. So this from the perspective of the states or the regions, are we witnessing slowly or surely the comeback of neutrality as a if we're thinking
I would say that neutrality concept describe its foreign policy. And in fact, one of the reasons President Lopez Obrador gave for not taking a stronger position on the war or for support for Ukraine was citing this diplomatic tradition of neutrality. The other countries in the region, I think, there's a long-running debate about what their best strategy is for dealing with the world. And it's oscillated between two poles. One is often called Pan-Americanism, which is we should bandwagon with the United States, excuse me, against the old world. And the other one is Bolivarianism, which is we need to counterbalance the United States. We need to hedge. We can't be so dependent or subject to U.S. influence or interests. And so I think that kind of pushes you away from neutrality. That pushes you more towards moving back and forth on the policy spectrum between support and opposition to U.S. Interests in the region and in the world. And that's still an ongoing debate. And so what has become a more popular term in the region, at least some academics, IR theorists have popularized this, is active non-alignment. It sounds almost like triangulating on the issues to preserve the strategic space for action for Latin American countries and not get too committed to one side or another.
It's fascinating that you bring up the concept of neutrality because at the height of the first Afghan crisis during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the outgoing Indian Foreign Secretary, the highest ranking bureaucrat in the foreign ministry, a man called Jagat Mehta, whom I knew quite well, wrote a fascinating article, which sadly no one paid heed to in the United States. It was called Afghanistan, a Neutral Solution, where he talked about guaranteeing Afghans' neutrality and thereby allowing the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan and bringing an end to the crisis. The Reagan administration paid little or no heed to it and probably thought this was a quaint idea. But India is clearly not neutral in this. It cannot afford to be neutral for all the reasons that I outlined. And consequently, no one is bringing up in the Indian attentive public, no one's bringing up the idea of a neutral Ukraine for fear of alienating the Russians.
I've got an interesting question. I have an interesting question from a Ukrainian scholar online. I'm asking if the war doesn't end in the first day of Trump's presidency, as he has claimed, and especially if it is seen that it is Putin as being recalcitrant, what are your thoughts on whether the Trump administration will put sanctions not only on China, but also on India for its supplying technology or other things to the Russian military manufacturers? I think that's mostly for you, Šumit, but others could chime in too.
The Indians, to my knowledge, have no technology to proffer to the Russians. And the only thing that has happened is some Indians, out of a sense of desperation for the lack of employment, went to Russia in the belief that they would not be drafted to the front. And to their horror, once they got to Russia, there was no employment in Moscow, and they were sent to fight. And the Indians have been scrambling and begging Putin, please repatriate these poor souls, because they were completely misled by Russian touts. And this is causing us considerable grief in key constituencies. And we would like to resolve this. No, there's no technology transfer that I'm aware of unless this is sort of hyper secret and completely clandestine, which I really, frankly doubt.
The gentleman in the right there raising a hand, and then afterwards, you have,
My name
yeah, please.
My name is Hector Fuentes. I'm a visiting scholar at CDDRL from Venezuela. My question was about BRICS and about how that seems like an active strategy for circumventing sanctions and making the US dollar lose its importance for trade and then helping to circumvent sanctions. And it includes the three countries. And then what do you think of Trump's announced strategy to impose 100% tariffs if these countries keep pushing for an alternative to the US dollar?
So, thank you, Hector. I do think it's, from the Brazilian perspective, BRICS has value. It's certainly not the most prominent partner. I mean, the thing about BRICS is that China far outweighs the rest of them in terms of its resources and economic importance. And Brazil's, of course, in a slightly awkward situation in that Brazil and India are democracies and sort of Russia and China are not. And well, obviously South Africa also a democracy. So I think they want to preserve that space because from Brazil's perspective, BRICS is a way of trying to influence the current international order by saying, if you don't make more space for us as a emerging power in places like the World Bank or the IMF or other major institutions, well, we'll go create our own institutions, like the reserve currency arrangement instead of the IMF, or the BRICS Bank instead of the World Bank. And so that's why it's important to them, more so than the kind of relationship with necessarily Russia and China. I mean, the thing about Brazil domestically is that there are actors that are sort of not thrilled about Chinese actions, especially the Brazilian manufacturing sector, because there's lots of non-tariff barriers to exports to China. So they much prefer to work with the US and Europe. But on the other hand, the agro-industrial sector of Brazil is enormous and very influential, and they do favor working with China. So even within Brazil, the politics of the BRICS relationship is kind of a little bit paralyzing in terms of making any significant changes there. But Brazil still sees BRICS as a useful construct.
Yeah, so I think that China, so the BRICS is not at the forefront of Chinese thinking when it comes to sort of potential tariffs in the U.S.-China relationship. So and I wouldn't expect 100% tariffs, but I think that the potential move to different reserve currencies, like I think there will certainly be much higher tariffs on Chinese goods in the Trump administration, but that won't be the source of them. So I think that if you're thinking about new tariffs, I think it's going to come from economic competition, focusing on overcapacity issues, dumping issues. I think that one new area that's receiving a lot of attention is the idea of transshipment. So technically speaking, if you're sort of exporting a good from China, if it goes to some other country for a material improvement or change in that good, so the appearance of the good or the functionality of the good, it can be classified as being exported from that next country to the United States. So that's a very powerful way of evading sanctions if you can sort of make the case that that good changes in a materially important way in that second country. And that's the focus of a lot of Chinese business right now. So I was recently speaking with a group of Chinese entrepreneurs, and there was huge interest in how to set up factories or have some sort of business operation in Mexico in particular to evade potential sanctions, and through NAFTA sort of evade potential tariffs that would really materially affect their business. So I think that transshipment sort of looking, so I think there will be more regulations trying to identify the original country in which the good was produced as a way to sort of reapply tariffs. I think that will be an important focus to sort of get around this tariff evasion, the interest that has recently come
up. From India's standpoint, Harold practically took the words out of my mouth. Striking similarities between Brazil and India. They do not want to overturn the existing international order. They merely want to be taken as a player in the international order, not to be the object of something. institutions hark back to 1946. It's time to reorder these institutions, especially as we become much more powerful. That's the standard Indian argument, and it's cut across regimes. And I'm old enough to remember when India was a player in something called the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was seen as an alternative to the IMF, World Bank domination of the global order. And it's fascinating. It's
I want to push a little bit on the drone issue and the technology of also the effect of China and India. My first question is simply, we know that simple drone systems have been essential for the Ukrainian side, and given the supply from China of these drone systems, firstly, how essential were drone export from China to Ukraine in their effort, given the heavy consumption of simple drone system in the war? Secondly, did Russia ever try to stop this diplomatically, as you're aware of? The second question would go to both of you. It's basically, you had these predictions at the start of the war saying that the Russian economy was going basically to be so heavily hit that it will basically stop to function. And when people try to explain why it didn't stop, some of them will explain it with basically reserve funds. Some of it will explain it with this black economy. Some of experts, they will say that maybe it's doing worse than we know. But you have a fourth explanation that I would like to have your comment on. And we didn't discuss that. We very often discuss weapon support. But to which extent was it market access to China and India, given their quite high GDP adjusted for purchasing power? To which extent was it market access that actually offset some of the troubles of the Russian economy?
We have too many people about to ask questions, so I'm going to just collect all the questions, and then you choose which one you want to respond to, because especially when people ask more than one question, it's hard to get through them all. So we have individual here, and Ori, you can ask your question, and then the gentleman in the back. Right, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Norbert Holtkamp. I'm a science fellow at Hoover, and I think about international collaboration and how they're going to work in the future in this whole environment.
Kind of SLAC, right?
Yes, I was a deputy director of SLAC. So this is for Šumit actually. So I'm surprised how much strategic thinking in India seems to be driven by weapons and getting weapons in there. Just the amount of time you talked about it, it's kind of indicative of this, right? That's really true. So here's the question. If there's only one economy, namely the Russian one, that has really, ramped up to be a war economy, right? So Russia builds now more tanks in 1 month than Europe in the whole year, including all this other stuff that they're building. So if I were India and I were looking for somebody providing with weapons, I go to Russia. At the same time, there's probably no Russian defense system that doesn't have a Chinese chip in it. Okay, so in the US, we don't even have Huawei anymore, right? So aren't the Chinese worried about, the Indians worried about having Chinese control chips in their defense systems? And on the other hand, I would be a little bit, Aaron, but do you see any effort in the US to actually counter that market and deliver these 20, 40, 50, 60 billions?
Interesting. Ori, do you have a question? We'll just collect questions, but you won't be able to answer them all.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ori Rabinowitz. I'm a visiting professor. I'm an Israel studies professor, visiting professor from the Hebrew University. And my question is about the Middle East. How do you think that the ineffectiveness of Russian air defense system in Iran, the S-300, and Russia's military ineffectiveness now in Syria will impact views going forward vis-a-vis Ukraine, but more generally. Thank you.
And then last, the gentleman in front of Tobias. Yes.
Hi, Taylor Dalton. I teach law, and I like to teach that the students should still believe that law matters in conflict. And I was curious to hear your perspectives on how these different regions view changes to the law or efforts to hold individuals accountable, like at the International Criminal Court or the ICJ. Where do you see things going? Do they care at all? And are they going to be antagonistic to those different courts, or maybe support their efforts?
The good news is that we have time to answer one of the questions. And then after we thank you, if people could come up who asked the questions, they can address some of the other ones after the 5 o'clock. So why don't you pick which one, Erin, you want to answer?
Sure. Well, on drones, I can actually answer both Stig and Norbert's at the same time, briefly, I promise. So Stig is exactly right that China has sold these commercial dual-use drones to both Ukraine and Russia. That's been a consistent thing until July 2024. So just very recently, China banned exports of drones for military use. And since that time, the enforcement of that ban has been very selective, especially because the components that it exports to the US and Ukraine that very active. The selective bans there are very important substantively to how Ukraine has access to these drones, both from China directly and from companies that use Chinese products and export from the US and EU. That said, that leads right into Norbert's question. More semiconductors, drones, and other things here. And more recently, due to this sensitivity about drone exports and components, the DoD developed the replicator program to try to produce more drones here. And I think that the contours of how exactly that's going to happen and how the funding is going to be allocated remain to be seen. But I think those are steps in the right direction.
I'll answer.
Maybe I'll take the last question on international law. And I think as a region, Latin America, with the exception of the autocratic regimes, remains very committed to international law when it comes to conflict, when it comes to sovereignty, ban on aggressive war, and especially, I'm not so sure what the position is in the ICC, although generally I suspect it's quite favorable, but on the ICJ, strong supporter. Decades-long suits over border disputes are taken regularly by states across the region to the ICJ. So I think it's really quite supportive. And when we do see instances of conflict between states, there was a Colombian cross-border strike into Ecuador against Colombian rebels that immediately galvanizes the region. The summit of the leaders convene, criticize uniformity of support for international laws being what should regulate relations among states.
Please join me in thanking Erin, Šumit, and Harold for this very interesting and different seminar. I think it's format was really well.
Thank you.